Yo, what is going on, everyone? My name is Nick, or the Notorious Fantasy, and in today's video, we're going to be talking about my top 5 wide receiver steals for fantasy football in 2021. Inside today's video, I'm going to go in depth in breaking each of these wide receivers down and why I believe that they are a steal where they're going at their current average draft position. But before we get on into it, I'd like to let you guys know that today's show is being brought to you by our brand new podcast, Betting You. Who will win the Heisman in 2021? Could Georgia dethrone Alabama? Which MAC team should you be putting your money on? These questions and more are answered every single Wednesday with Matt Gajowski and Ben Ross as they talk all things college football betting. We have episodes available now on nearly every single podcast platform, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So go ahead and check them out today. So let's get on into the top 5 wide receiver steals. First up, we're going to be talking about wide receiver of the Denver Broncos, Jerry Jeudy. Underdog ADP right now coming off the board as wide receiver number 30, pick 66.3. In 16 games last year, Jerry Jeudy finished as the wide receiver number 45 in PPR, 44.5 PPR, and the wide receiver number 43 in standard, averaging 9.8 PPR points per game, 8.2 half PPR points per game, and 6.6 standard points per game. Meaning, from a points per game perspective, Jerry Jeudy finished as the wide receiver 59 in PPR, 57.5 PPR, and the wide receiver number 57 in standard. So last season for Jerry Jeudy was instantly turned completely upside down like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, because right off the rip of the season, Courtland Sutton ended up getting hurt, his teammate, the other wide receiver on the team, and this made Jerry Jeudy, the rookie, elevate himself from being the clear wide receiver 2 on this roster into being the number 1 wide receiver threat on this team. Match that with the quarterback play being very subpar last season in Mr. Drew Lock, that all things basically went bad for Jerry Jeudy, including even Jerry Jeudy's play, because this guy was a drop machine in 2020. Can you blame it all on him? Probably not, because the quarterback play, like I said, was really fucking bad at times. But you could definitely blame him at some points. He had 113 targets on the season, 7.1 per game, ranking 21st at the wide receiver position for 52 receptions, 3.2 per game, ranking 51st at wide receiver for 856 receiving yards, 53.5 per game, ranking 30th at wide receiver for 3 total touchdowns. His catch rate last season was only 46.0. 46.0% of the time the ball was thrown his way, he caught it. That's not very good. His target quality rating, though, was 4.2, 102nd at wide receiver. So, like I was saying, sure, he wasn't necessarily getting his hands wrapped around the ball correctly. It wasn't necessarily all on the quarterback's fault, but you can put some blame on him. It was a 62.8% catchable target rate to Jerry Jeudy last season, ranking 105th at wide receiver. He only had 71 targets that were deemed catchable. So obviously, it wasn't necessarily on him. I believe in this offseason, Jerry Jeudy's going to work a lot on catching the ball a lot better, which is something that it should be pretty clear since he was one of the best wide receivers in college football in 2019, and that is why he was drafted so highly in the 2020 NFL draft. So with Jerry Jeudy, just don't overthink it. We've seen the talent at Alabama. We've seen what he could do at Denver. When the ball was actually thrown his way, he actually looked pretty good. So I think that this season, after working on catching the ball correctly, after having the quarterbacks potentially level out here, Drew Lock is allegedly looking pretty solid in camp, and if he ends up sucking ass and kind of throwing away his job, then Teddy Bridgewater is there. Obviously, Teddy Bridgewater is no Patrick Mahomes, but he is still a solid quarterback, so I think things this season are going to look a lot better for Jerry Jeudy, and a lot of word out of camp is that Courtland Sutton isn't doing too well on his rehab, meaning that maybe it's going to be a slow start for Courtland Sutton, or maybe he ends up missing the first couple of games of the season, which obviously isn't the best for Jerry Jeudy, but it will obviously include an uptick in targets for Jerry Jeudy. I project a much better season in 2021, and I will put some emphasis on the fact that it was a COVID offseason into trying to understand why maybe he didn't have that great of a rookie season. But I'm going to believe in my eyes in the talent and not necessarily look too much into the fact that he was dropping some balls last season. At number 2, the number 2 wide receiver steal of this video is going to be wide receiver of the Houston Texans, underdog ADP, wide receiver 44, overall pick 89.0, Brandin Cooks. Now, Brandin Cooks is probably the least sexy name at the wide receiver receiver position that you can get, because he's the wide receiver on a Houston Texans team that we frankly have no idea who the quarterback is going to be. Is it going to be Tyrod Taylor? Is it going to be Davis Mills? Or could it be Deshaun Watson? Now, Deshaun Watson has not been practicing recently because of apparent leg injuries, but he has been in the team meetings for the Houston Texans, so he could be the quarterback, and the league hasn't ruled him out. He's not on the commissioner's exempt list, so he could play. Based upon what we know right now, Deshaun Watson could be the quarterback of the Houston Texans. I know that he wants out of the Houston Texans, but it doesn't seem like any type of movement is happening, so he could end up being the starting quarterback this year. Whether or not it is Deshaun Watson obviously affects my opinion on him, because Brandin Cooks to me is a very big target in my drafts. Now, if Tyrod Taylor's the starter, then maybe I don't target him every single time. He's not one of those big glaring targets at the wide receiver position. But if Deshaun Watson is the guy there, Brandin Cooks genuinely could finish as a top 15, top 24 wide receiver, and he's going off the board as wide receiver number 44. Last year, in 15 games, Brandin Cooks was the wide receiver 17 in PPR, 15.5 PPR, and the wide receiver number 16 in standard. Meaning, from a points per game perspective, he was the wide receiver 16 in PPR, tied with Mike Evans, 18.5 PPR, and the wide receiver 17 in standard, tied with Allen Robinson, averaging 15.5 PPR points per game, 12.8 half PPR points per game, and a grand total of 10.1 standard points per game. Now, if you put your thinking cap on and tried to imagine what Brandin Cooks did last year, you probably would have thought he didn't do anything, which was my perception of what happened last year, until I actually looked at the numbers and realized that this guy was really fucking good last year. He had 119 targets, 7.9 per game, ranking 18th at wide receiver. He had 81 receptions, 5.4 per game, ranking 19th at wide receiver, 1,143 receiving yards, 76.2 per game, ranking number 10 at wide receiver, and 6 total touchdowns, ranking 24th at the wide receiver position. Brandin Cooks is the clear alpha wide receiver in Houston, and he is going outside of the top 40 at the wide receiver position. Explain to me how that even happens. Because even if there's subpar quarterback play, it doesn't matter, because he's the number one target on this team. I understand that Anthony Miller may step up now that he's been traded there. I understand that Nico Collins could have an excellent rookie season. But to me, none of those guys are going to beat out Brandin Cooks. Brandin Cooks is one of the more reliable wide receivers in the NFL. A lot of people will try to dissect that reliable tag and say that Brandin Cooks is an injury-prone wide receiver, but when I tell you that he's not actually injury-prone, all you have to do is look at his game log. 2020, played in 15 games. 2019, played in 14 games. The only reason why people think that Brandin Cooks is an injury-prone wide receiver is because when he gets hurt, it's one of those big clips that you see every single time on Twitter when you open it up. It's because he gets that big concussion and he's out a couple of games and then he is back out on the field. So Brandin Cooks to me is not really an injury-prone wide receiver, and he is the clear wide receiver number one on this team, like I will continue to harp on. Most wide receiver ones don't get drafted outside of the top 40 at the wide receiver position. So I believe Brandin Cooks is both safe and has tons of upside, because last year, like I said, he was the wide receiver 17 in PPR, 15.5 PPR, and the wide receiver 16 in standard. There isn't much that has changed in Houston from that time, so I'm pretty confident that even if the quarterback play isn't as good, that Brandin Cooks is a very safe and basically a wide receiver steal at this point where he's going. Next up, we have wide receiver of the Chicago Bears, underdog ADP, wide receiver number 49, overall pick 97.8, Darnell. Here comes the Mooney. In 16 games, Darnell Mooney finished as the wide receiver 49 in PPR, 51.5 PPR, and the wide receiver number 55 in standard, averaging 9.5 PPR points per game, 7.6 half PPR points per game, and 5.7 standard points per game. Meaning, from a points per game perspective, Darnell Mooney was the wide receiver 62 in PPR, 64 in half PPR, and the wide receiver number 73 in standard. Doing all of this with piss poor quarterback play. This was an embarrassment. Darnell Mooney would be wide open. I'm talking about no one is in the next stratosphere of this guy. He could run around circles around for a while and no one's even near him. But you want to know what happens when no one's near him? When he's wide open, Mitch Trubisky sails the ball 50 yards over him or underthrows him. And then when Nick Foles is in the game, the exact same thing happens. Now, I'm not someone that's going to stand here and tell you that Andy Dalton is the next, I don't know, Matt Ryan or someone who's pretty accurate at throwing the ball. Patrick Mahomes, Kyler Murray, anyone like that, any of those upper echelon quarterbacks in the NFL. I'm not going to tell you that. But what I am going to tell you is that Andy Dalton is a step above Nick Foles and a step above Mitch Trubisky. And then we can get a couple of steps even higher when a couple of weeks into this season, which is what I believe, is that Justin Fields will become the starter of this Chicago Bears team. If you have a wide receiver that is as fast as Darnell Mooney, who ran a 4.3840, 95th percentile in the National Football League at the wide receiver position, who is always open, and you have a quarterback that can actually throw him the ball, and now he has moved up spaces on the team. He was originally, in my opinion at least, the wide receiver 3 on this team. Anthony Miller was ahead of him, but the Anthony Miller experiment has been completed. There is no more Anthony Miller in town in Chicago. He got traded to the Houston Texans, so the door is even more wide open for a tremendous breakout season for Darnell Mooney. Last year, he had 98 targets, 6.1 per game, ranking 36th at the wide receiver position, 61 receptions, 3.8 per game, ranking 36th at wide receiver for 631 receiving yards, 39.4 per game, ranking 55th at wide receiver for 4 total touchdowns. Obviously, when you're reading those stats, you're not going to sit there and think, man, I need to draft Darnell Mooney. He is a must draft player. But to me, the upside Darnell Mooney really has is kind of unmatched by these wide receivers near the wide receiver 50 range, currently coming off the board at wide receiver number 49. I understand that every single year there's going to be these late round players that people hitch their wagon to that ends up missing. But in my opinion, I believe that Darnell Mooney is not going to be a miss. I believe he has a straight shot to being a flex option week in and week out in your lineup as long as Andy Dalton isn't terrible, and as long as Justin Fields shows the potential that I believe that he has, because Darnell Mooney is going to be open. All we need to have is a quarterback that can sail the ball his way and not throw it 50 fucking yards over his head. Next up, we have wide receiver of the Baltimore Ravens, rookie wide receiver out of Minnesota, Mr. Rashod Bateman, underdog ADP wide receiver number 55, overall pick 109.9. Last season, we saw a whole bunch of rookie wide receivers take the league by a storm. We had CeeDee Lamb, we had T. Higgins, we had Justin Jefferson, obviously. But this season, maybe we don't see that immense amount of wide receivers blow up. But one that I really do believe in this year is Rashod Bateman, wide receiver of the Baltimore Ravens. Now, the Baltimore Ravens obviously are not one of those teams that is going to be a super pass-heavy attack, and that could worry some, but to me, there is a clear wide receiver 1 on this team, and his name is not Hollywood Brown. It's not Marquise Brown, because Hollywood Brown, year in and year out, is one of the biggest disappointments in fantasy football. You draft him because you're like, man, this guy has so much upside. He's so fast. But in reality, all he has is 3 good games the whole year, and the rest of the time he's leaving you out to dry. He's not doing anything. But I believe Rashod Bateman's the guy with the upside to drop 25 plus points a game, but he also has the safety of the fact that he's not just a guy that is a deep down the field target. You can target Rashod Bateman all over the field, and with the news that Hollywood Brown is banged up and Rashod Bateman is looking really good in training camp, if you guys have seen a lot of videos coming out of the camp for the Baltimore Ravens, Rashod Bateman seems to be Lamar Jackson's favorite target, which points in the complete positive direction for the argument that I'm making in this video. Last year at Minnesota, he played in 5 games, had 36 receptions on 56 targets, 472 receiving yards, 13.1 yards per reception, and 2 total touchdowns. 2019, in 13 games, he had 60 receptions, 93 targets, 1,219 receiving yards, 20.3 yards per receptions, and 11 total touchdowns on the season. I'm not saying that Rashod Bateman is going to finish as a top 10 wide receiver like a guy like Justin Jefferson did last season, but I'm willing to take the chance outside of the top 55 on a wide receiver that can become the wide receiver number 1 on his team for the Baltimore Ravens. Before we get on into the final wide receiver of this video, I want to let you guys know that we have a brand new YouTube channel for sports betting. If you love what we do on the DFS channel and you love what we do here for fantasy football, then you are going to want to subscribe to the Awesemo Odds channel. You can find the link in the description of this video, so go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, turn the notification bell on, and enjoy what we have in store for sports betting. If you want to check out additional free content that we are offering, you can check out our free fantasy football rankings in front front of the paywall on Awesemo.com fantasy football tab. And for sports betting, you can check out the Awesemo odds tab for access to the odds shopper and our MLB betting tools, which include our sports betting model and our player props tool. If you guys also want to check something out, check out my articles on the fantasy football tab on Awesemo.com. I write articles every single day about fantasy football, so make sure you check those out as well. Back into it. Final wide receiver. This is a guy that has been in my sights, in my target for months now, and he's been in that scope. And I think, based upon what I know right now, I feel very confident in this, that he could be the wide receiver 1 in Jacksonville. Marvin Jones, underdog ADP, wide receiver number 57 off the board, overall pick 115.4. Now, there is some smoke out of camp that DJ Chark is lighting it up. Okay? So that's not really worrisome to me because there's also reports that Laviska's looking good, and there's also reports that Marvin Jones is looking good. So when we have a scenario like this where the whole camp is lighting it up, all these wide receivers are playing good, then I'm just going to take the one that's going latest off the board, and that is by far and away Marvin Jones. And I want to give you guys a quick spoiler alert. You want to know why these wide receivers are destroying in training camp? Because they're playing up against the Jaguars defense. The Jaguars defense is terrible. So, shouldn't be much surprise that a guy like Marvin Jones, a guy like Laviska, a guy like DJ Chark is going to tear them up, especially when they have a quarterback named Trevor Lawrence, who is maybe one of the best talents to come out of college in recent memory. In 16 games last year, Marvin Jones finishes the wide receiver 18 in PPR, 17.5 PPR, and the wide receiver number 15 in standard. From a points per game perspective, he was the wide receiver 26 in PPR, 21.5 PPR, and the wide receiver number 22 in standard, averaging 14.2 PPR points per game, 11.9 half PPR points per game, and 9.5 standard points per game in Detroit. Obviously, in the offseason, he made that change from Detroit to Jacksonville. Now, in Detroit, he was always one of those wide receivers that was severely underrated, that was finishing in the top 20, top 24 year in, year out when he wasn't hurt, and was still getting slept upon in fantasy football, getting drafted way too late. And now, in Jacksonville, it appears to be the exact same thing. Now, there's a lot more competition for targets here because in Detroit, it was a 1A, 1B scenario. It was Kenny Golladay and it was Marvin Jones, the yin and the yang of this Detroit Lions offense. But here in Jacksonville, it's a three-way type of wide receiver deal here with Marvin Jones, DJ Chark, and Laviska Shenault. But I'm still willing to take this shot on Trevor Lawrence being really good, the defense being really bad, and Marvin Jones seeing a lot of targets in this offense. Last season, he had 115 targets in Detroit, 7.2 per game, ranking 20th at the wide receiver position, 76 receptions, 4.8 per game, ranking 22nd at the wide receiver position, 978 receiving yards, 19th at the wide receiver position, and 9 total touchdowns on the season. So again, I'm not asserting to you right now that Marvin Jones is the clear, by far and away, wide receiver 1 in targets in this Jacksonville offense, because right now I don't think we can make that claim. But I do believe that taking the latest player, the one going the latest in drafts, on a team where everyone seems to be playing well, I would do that. I would be taking the later shot, because what if DJ Chark is the guy? That's fine, because you drafted Marvin Jones in one of the last picks of your draft. But if Marvin Jones is the guy and you drafted DJ Chark in the 8th round, the 7th round, the 6th round, you're going to feel like a fucking idiot. So I would rather just wait on Marvin Jones and go ahead and take him, because I believe he's a very talented wide receiver and has a pretty good shot at becoming the wide receiver 1 in targets here in Jacksonville this season. So thank you guys all so much for watching. Make sure that if you did end up enjoying today's video, to please make sure to hit that subscribe button down below. Not only is it free, we put out content every single day on the YouTube channel. Make sure you check out all the links in the description as well, and follow me on Twitter at NotoriousFNTSY, at NotoriousFNTSY. I love you guys. Make sure you stay safe as always. Have a great rest of your guys' day. See you beautiful people tomorrow. Goodbye.